all they probably do is squeal, but chill. When we start the revolution, when we start the revolution.
Thank you very much. I apologize if we kept you waiting too long. I certainly am appreciative of your invitation to appear before you here today to talk about black child development under white supremacy. A very, very important topic indeed, because it is the root of many of the issues and problems that we discuss so often in these types of forums. I, of course, think it is very important that when we talk about the black child, that we have some idea of who or what the black child is. Because too often we hear people saying, I happen to be black. You know, as if black is something that fell on us, unfortunately, some misfortune, you know. And also there's the implication often in that kind of phrase that except for our blackness, we are just like everybody else. So consequently, we are colored people, you know. We've just been colored over, but in a sense, we are white people who just happen to be black. It's much deeper than that, ladies and gentlemen. The black child is unique. It is not a duplicate of the white child. It is not a colored rendition of white children. It's very important that you know that, because if you start off with that premise, no matter how good your intentions, you're going to do a disservice to your children. If you're going to do the right things about your children, you must know them, which means that you must study their history and their psychology. You cannot study the history of Europeans and the psychology of the European child and apply that psychology directly to black children. One of the major problems in education today is that we have a school system, and your children have inherited a school system that was designed to teach the white child. A school system that is based on the developmental psychology of white children. That psychology develops out of the history and experience of a people. Psychology, you must recognize, reflects the individual's history and experience. That is why if you go to a psychologist's office or psychiatrist's office or social worker's office, they must take your case history. They cannot reach into the files and get anybody's case history and say, now let me see and let me explain you in terms of this case history. They have to speak directly to you and get that information from you. Otherwise, they misinterpret you. Why do they get a case history? Because they recognize that to a very significant extent, the way a person sees the world, relates to the world, behaves in the world, the attitudes, feelings, and emotions, that person's abilities and so forth are intimately related to that individual's unique history and experience. The same thing is true of a people. The history and experience of African American people is not the history and experience of European American people. These histories are diametrically opposed. We have some Negroes who run around and say, I am an American. They live in abstractions. It's a meaningless term. Besides, if it had meaning, it wouldn't mean the same thing for the two people. Because the African American experience of slavery in the United States is not the white American experience of slave mastery in the United States. A whole psychology comes from these two histories. A whole set of attitudes, a whole way of seeing the world and dealing with the world comes from these two histories. So you're both saying that you are American does not resolve the difference and does not resolve the psychology. Consequently, you cannot hide behind euphemistic platitudes about being an American or being a human being or all these other words you've used to escape your reality and your history and get away with it. It'll only do harm to yourself. The educational psychology upon which the education of children is based is an educational psychology based on the history and experience of white folk. That is the reason why it is not working for our children. That's why you have to study the developmental psychology of your own children first, and then relate that psychology to their education. But if you go and get the psychology of white children, ignore the history and experience of our people, and seek to impose that psychology, both in your pedagogical approaches and other approaches, the education will make our children dumb, and that's exactly what it does. Your love will not be enough. Your good intentions will not be enough. Because if you have the wrong knowledge and the wrong understanding, you will still destroy despite your good intentions. So it becomes very important for you to know your children and to study their development, because that development is unique. When I left New York, I was looking at a New York Times that was talking about how the evolutionary history of mankind had been traced back to the so-called African Eve. And no matter which way they work it, the history of man leads back to African man, and to the fact then that African man is the mother and father of mankind. This is what your children represent. They're not just colored children. The genes that you carry in your bodies are not mere chemical packets that determine how tall you're going to be, or determine other physiological features or some psychological features. These genes that we carry in our bodies are also capsulated forms of history. In other words, we carry in our bodies the complete history of our people from the very beginning. Every experience that they've had, biological, cultural, and otherwise, has been in some way encoded in our genetic code. So when we talk about these children then, if we're talking about African man and woman as the fathers of mankind, then they carry that history in their bodies, and this history is not carried by any other children on this earth. This is their history. If we are then to talk about African man as laying down the first civilizations on this earth, as developing language, social relations, governments, science, and so forth, that history too is encoded in our genes. And this is what it means to be a black child, you see. The biological evolutionary history of black people is not the biological evolutionary history of white folk. This body, these bodies that we refer to as African bodies, were African bodies shaped to adapt to the African soil, African geography and geology. Therefore, they cannot be duplicates of European bodies. Therefore, ultimately, to even understand in detail the biology of the African body, you must come to study the biological evolutionary history of African people. That's why even, ladies and gentlemen, even in modern medicine, we're recognizing that the African body does not react in the same way to medicines and other things as does the European body. Now doctors are beginning to realize what they realized even in the 60s and 70s, but because it was politically unwise, they did not talk about it. And that was the idea that you must take the ethnicity of the individual in mind if you're to give them the best medical treatment. Because the biological history of a people is still represented in their very bodies. Therefore, then, when you look at our history, whether it is the biological history, cultural history, or the history of African people on this continent, it must strike you then that it is very important for us to recognize that we have a psychology that we must come to know. That biological history implies that the black child, the body of the black child, does not develop as a duplicate of the white child's body. Some of you who read my book, of course, have run across this passage when we talk about, where I talked about the growth and development of the black child's body. To the extent we indicated that the difference in growth is such that the black child needs a different nutritional chart than does the European child. Let me read a passage here. Both on an absolute basis and when corrected for income level, black boys and girls in comparison to white children tended to have skeletal advancement, ossification, dental advancement, age at permanent teeth eruption, and earlier maturation, and some tendency toward greater body size, notwithstanding lesser body fat through adolescence. Black boys and girls evidenced a greater mass on both a group basis and on an income-corrected basis. Therefore, genetic factors outweighed economic factors in explaining differences in skeletal and dental development. These findings suggest the need for a different standard for blacks and white children when assessing nutritional status during growth. This was published by the American Academy of Pediatrics. What are we saying here then? That the biological evolutionary history of African people is still written in the bodies of African children, African American children today. You can't wipe that history out in 300 and 400 years. No way. It is still written so deeply and engraved so deeply until we need our own nutritional charts to meet our own children's needs. So this is not a child who happens to be black or who is, colored. Jensen, the infamous Jensen who looked at these children, stated, "It has been noted that the brainwave patterns in African newborn infants show greater maturity than is usually found in European newborn child," that is, in the European newborn child. This finding especially merits further study, since there is evidence that brain waves have some relationship to IQ, and since at least one aspect of brain waves, the visually evoked potential, has a very significant genetic component showing a heritability of about 0.8. I won't go into the technical details here, but essentially what he's saying is these children are born at a more advanced level of intellectual development than our European children. And when you look at their brainwave patterns, these brainwave patterns, which seem to be related to what we later call IQ or intelligence, would indicate then that these children's intelligence is inherently more advanced than white children. That's why he says this merits further study, because of course he has to deal with the whole propaganda that he himself has projected. Let's look a moment at a book, The Magical Child by Chilton Pearce. When he talks about the studies done by Marcel Gibert, to whom I make reference as well in my own book. And let me read a bit of what he has to say about these African children. And what I'm reading here in terms of the Ugandan and Kenyan children is duplicated by African American children. And he states that in 1956, Marcel Gibert, under a research grant from the United Nations Children's Fund, traveled to Africa to study the effects of malnutrition on infant and child intelligence. She concentrated on Kenya and Uganda and made a momentous discovery. She found the most precocious, brilliant, and advanced infants and children observed anywhere. And I think if you look at what we're going to talk about today, you'll see these are not exaggerated statements. These infants had smiled continuously and rapturously from, at the latest, their 4th day of life. Blood analysis showed that they all had all the adrenal steroids